What a coincidence. I have a cousin named Die231 as well. Anyway, in all seriousness, do you guys believe in UFOs or aliens?
When I was in a homeless shelter in Holbrook, Arizona, I saw a UFO over the I-40 highway. I was just sitting there smoking a cigarette with one of my good friends and saw a trail of sparks going across the sky. I looked a bit closer, and it was literally what you see in the books, a saucer with a cockpit on top. I wasn't the only one who saw it too. My buddy ran inside and told the others at the shelter, and they all saw the same thing, so I knew I wasn't going crazy. It stopped over the I-40 for a minute or two and just disappeared. Holbrook is a weird-ass place, and that wasn't the only weird encounter I had there either. I was 12-ish in the mid-90s. I was visiting my aunt in the countryside. I'm there just chilling in the living room with my cousins, and my father rushes in. "Yo, Die231, there's a flying saucer in the sky." None of us believed him, so he just grabs me and drags me outside. Out in the street, my mom, my aunt, and all the neighbors are out and pointing at the sky. There was a light identical to a very bright star, but moving ridiculously fast and doing some crazy movements and sharp turns. I watched it for a few minutes and got bored and went back inside.
What a coincidence. I have a cousin named Die231 as well. Anyway, in all seriousness, do you guys believe in UFOs or aliens?
I was driving to Las Vegas and had given myself an extra 2 hours for my flight. I remember a bright light behind me and was annoyed. Next second, I'm an hour later, 30 miles in the wrong direction. I turned around and drove back, could barely keep my eyes open, and barely had time to park and fly. It was so weird. So I have insomnia, and one night I was staying around my parents, who live in the middle of the British countryside. They are quite literally surrounded by fields, and at about 2 a.m. these really low vibrating humming sounds started coming from outside. It got louder and louder until it literally sounded like there was a helicopter. Happened in the space of about 2 minutes, or something about to land on the roof. Then there was a series of lights, sort of flashing, but they moved quickly upwards at the same time. That lasted for about 10 seconds, until it all just stopped, dead silent. I was literally frozen, still have no idea to this day what happened, and I'm yet to experience anything similar. The only explanation I can think of is ETs. I was around 9 or 10 when I woke up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water. While looking out the window, I saw what looked to be a slow-moving shooting star. Then, in a completely different direction, it zoomed off past the horizon. Who knows what it could have been, but my headcanon is that it was a UFO. We were homeless for a bit in Oklahoma. The things that happened out in the area we lived were wild. I don't particularly believe in aliens visiting us or anything. I believe they probably exist on some level, but not the visiting Earth and abducting people kind. I fully believe what we saw was some sort of military exercise. We all woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like a jet engine right above us. We all started freaking out and watched as these two things way up in the sky danced around, shooting at one another, until one finally went down. It didn't explode or break apart. It was hit by something, and part of it was burning, so it sort of coasted down until we couldn't see it anymore. Nothing ever showed up in the news, no crash sites, nothing. But all of us can remember the distinct sound of the gunfire and how loud they were as they coasted back and forth. It was honestly kind of beautiful to see, if not absolutely terrifying to wake up to. My experiences are more a result of my childhood imagination, but still horrifying when they happened. I used to watch UFO programs on Discovery Channel in the 90s out of morbid curiosity. This led to nightmares and typical moments of apophyria, like seeing shadows on my walls or a set of eyes staring at me in the foot of my bed. I was 10 or 11 years old at the time. The scariest thing I recall was when I left my room to use the bathroom. Turning on the lights, I would have woke up my family, so I tiptoed in the dark, leery of any moment I perceived in the darkness. After using the bathroom and the slow, fearful tiptoeing back to my bed, I suddenly felt a jolt of fear, as though something were behind me. I made a panicked rush for bed, but when I reached it, I saw a shadow sit up in my bed and reach out at me. I screamed to the top of my lungs. My father woke up and turned on the lights. Of course, nothing was there. I was not allowed to watch those shows for a while. It's haunting what the mind can make real. I spent like 18 months in the desert between Barstow and Victorville for work. During that time, between coming home from work in the evening or drives to or from Vegas, I had 3 separate times I saw something that I can't explain. UFO at its most simplistic term. Each time was a solid light, warm white, that was hauling ass through the desert, maybe only 200 to 300 feet from the ground. While I would have guessed it was supersonic speed, no noise that I could hear over the wind noise of me driving. I had an EV, so no engine noise. It would rip by and just be gone. I rationalize it by the amount of military bases in the area, but no amount of Googling could find a match for what I saw. Last night I saw a Starlink satellite row pass overhead, and I swear it looked like it was barely 1,000 feet up and 500 feet long. I just couldn't reconcile what my eyes were telling me with my knowledge that glowing lights moving slowly and silently overhead are not a thing. I was really close to shouting at my neighbors, "Hey, get out here, look at this, what is that?" I went indoors and told my wife, and the dogs were freaking out, and she didn't seem to care that my whole world had shifted because I'd seen something I could not explain. Then I went inside and Googled. I've not, but my dad and grandpa have. When my dad was a teenager in the 80s, he went out hunting with Gramps in southern Idaho. They had made camp at the bottom of some foothills, and the plan was to hike up into them the next morning and start hunting. So early in the morning, probably around 3 a.m., Dad and Gramps start making their way up the hill. One thing to note about this region, it's pretty much just empty grassland and brush. You don't get many trees until you start heading into the mountains. So, Dad could easily see their campsite down below them, even in the moonlight. So, regarding that, at about halfway up the hill, Dad turns around to take a look at the valley below him, and he's confused by what he sees. Hovering around their campsite, about a mile away, are a dozen or so red lights. He couldn't tell how big they were, but they moved around seemingly at random. Not just on the valley floor, some of them had to have been several meters in the air. This was long before drones became a thing, and the closest human being to them had to have been at least 20 miles away. Just before Dad could raise his voice, Gramps roughly told him to keep moving, so he did, but kept looking back at the red lights still moving near their campsite. He tried to talk to Gramps, but he just shut him up and tell him to keep walking. Eventually, they make it to the top of the hill, and Grandpa suddenly tells Dad to crawl underneath a bush. They both get under one, and Gramps pulls out his binoculars. Turns out, he'd seen the lights all the way back while they were at camp. Apparently, they'd been approaching the camp from the other side of the valley, and Grandpa wanted to get some distance between them before he did anything. They laid there in the bush, quietly watching the lights. They couldn't tell what exactly was going on, but their activity was definitely centered around their camp. At about 5-ish, the sun started to peak above the hills, and right as it did, both Dad and Grandpa heard an extremely loud and high-pitched ringing coming from down in the valley. They assumed it was the lights that made the sound. After a few seconds of ringing, the lights began to rise into the sky until they were out of sight, and the ringing could not be heard. It was this event that made both of them question what they had seen. Grandpa had initially thought it might have been a group of bandits or something, but they can't fly. They stayed in that bush for a good 2 more hours until they decided the coast was clear and proceeded down the hill back to camp. When they arrived, it was clear that something had searched the camp. Nothing had been taken, items had been haphazardly thrown around, and anything that had been in a bag or container was now strewn around as well. They quickly left after packing everything up and never went back there again. Both of them still live in southern Idaho and will often recount this story whenever extraterrestrial stuff is brought up. I have seen 2, once when I was a teenager and once as an adult. The first, I was laying in my bed, looking out the window, and I saw a light floating above a nearby city tucked into the mountains. It then zoomed away at a speed that is just simply impossible with human technology. It lit up the entire city and mountainside when it left. I was frozen for a minute, just shocked that I'd witnessed it. The speed and light were just otherworldly. No doubt in my mind what I saw. The other was with a group of about 8 people out in the desert. We all saw it coursing across the sky, and the wild thing was that the stars and ambient light bent around it in a narrow teardrop shape. That teardrop eventually closed and was gone. All 8 people were a mix of veteran partiers or campers, and none of us had ever seen anything like it. Back in 2018, I was stargazing out in our backyard. Everything was great, and I saw a lot of stars using my telescope when out of nowhere, a red dot in the sky suddenly came out of nowhere. I observed it for a few seconds, and it flew away faster than any man-made aircraft. I told it to my classmates, and they made fun of me, saying that I was high. My ex and I were in the car in 2011, driving through town, and we saw 3 dots in the sky that were slowly rotating as it was slowly moving through the sky. Then it just went from slowly moving to speeding away with a quick trace of light behind it, and it was gone. There's no way that any man-made craft could have went from going slow to speeding out of sight so quickly like that.
Sometimes exes can't agree on anything, but if you both agreed you saw this, then I'd believe you.
I have a story. I was a preteen at this time, so it's okay if you don't believe me. Adults are stupid. It was June 25, 2001, close to midnight, Midwestern US. I had recently moved in with my grandparents with my 2 sisters. My grandma's sister and her husband were staying the night. It was Grandpa's birthday the next day, but I can't recall if that was their reason for staying. The 2 of them and my grandparents were chatting it up in the living room. I was still awake at that point, and I said hi, but I was wholly uninterested in their conversation, so I ducked out into the backyard. My grandpa's cat went outside with me. My grandparents used to own a big strip of land from one street to another, but they sold a greater portion of it. The neighbor was cool with me gallivanting through it, though. There was a set of houses on one side and a wooden area on the other, with a similar empty field beyond that. The cat started to explore the tree line, and I guess it tolerated me following it. We eventually walked across the field and back to the trees again. He went into the bushes, so I waited for him to pop out again. While waiting, I felt something was behind me. I heard a faint whirring and vibrating noise. I turned around and saw this nearly black, shiny object hover about as tall as the treetops. Its shape looked triangular, like an inverted pyramid. There was a slight wind that night, but the thing wasn't disturbing the grass or leaves like a big engine would. It had 3 steady lights on it, blue on its right, white on its left, and red on the underside. Now, when I would normally look in that direction, I would see a street light and trees, including a big-ass pine tree, but this thing was blocking those. I ran to the house. I looked back as soon as I got to the doorway, but it was already gone. Then I went back to the spot. Nothing. No buzzing or creepy feeling. Didn't seem like it was in the trees or in the neighboring field. I went back inside, now interested in company. The cat was let back in after a while. I stayed up pretty late that night. It was far too low, small, and steady to be a plane. It was also too quiet to be a helicopter. Hot air balloon is ruled out because there wasn't a basket. It could have been some drone or military technology far beyond younger me's imagination. Maybe it was pot brownies, and I was just too ignorant to notice the weird taste being unnatural. The ground was warm, but I feel like it was just soil, not any abandoned mines or burial grounds underneath. I also don't believe it was a murder of crows. The cat was also too small and rotund to be that object. Rest in pudginess. In 2013-ish, I was on a road trip with my stepdad. He was a truck driver, and we went from Cincinnati to California, California to Florida, and Florida to Cincinnati. We were driving through New Mexico in the daytime when my stepdad tells me to look in the sky. 3 orbs that looked like floaters appear in your vision were in the sky in a triangular formation. The middle part of the triangle was almost invisible, but you could see a slight outline. This UFO UAP flew over the interstate for about 30 more seconds after we noticed it, and then it blinked out of existence. I'm not sure if it was extraterrestrial. More likely than not, it was some sort of advanced military craft. Either way, I can't tell you exactly what I saw, except that it was weird. When I was a kid in the 90s, we would sometimes sit on our back porch looking at the night sky. At exactly the same time each night, we would see what we thought was a UFO passing overhead. It really only looked like a shadow, but it definitely wasn't an airplane. There were no lights on it, and it had very distinct shape. Both my father and I were totally perplexed, and of course, nobody we talked to really believed us. It wasn't until years later that I learned it was actually one of the NOAA weather satellites that was in orbit around the Earth.
So here's a great example of a perceived unidentified flying object, and then with research discovering that it was identifiable. So, cool.
My mom used to work opening shift at a bakery, so she would have to be there by 5 a.m. That meant she would wake us up at 4 a.m. and have us to our grandmother's by 4:30 a.m. One morning, I remember very distinctly that it was still dark out and we were just driving on our way on a residential city street, but up in the sky close to the horizon were three lights in a triangular shape. The odd thing was, they were moving all zigzag and crazy in the sky. My mom and all of my brothers watched this happen. It wasn't a reflection of something else in the glass of the car. This was three distinct lights in the shape of a triangle moving left, right, but also diagonally. We watched them for a few minutes, and then they just darted out of the sky. I live in CNY at the time, and this would have been in the early 90s, so definitely unexplained. I'm not a ghost believer, and in general, I'm an aesthetic skeptic about most things, but I cannot explain what we all saw. I should ask my older brother if he remembers this. It sounds simple, but gives me goosebumps to think about it because we actually saw this, and it made no logical sense. Don't know if it was a UFO, but it was something strange. My dad and I were outside on the deck simply looking at the night sky. It was a slightly starry night, but some stars were flashing red, green, blue, gold colors. They also moved around a bit, but nothing we could claim as UFO. It was just weird. Then, we look at our driveway and see this blue-white light moving towards the stairs. As it moved, it would flash like a strobe light. It also moved kind of fast, but it didn't make any noise. Dad and I were obviously scared as F, so we scrambled into the house and closed the door. Once the door was closed, we didn't hear or see anything else. We also didn't go back outside that night. Haven't seen it since, and I'm slightly glad for that. We don't know what it, if it was sentient, wanted. About a year ago, I was walking to the store with my daughter. As I was looking around, appreciating the scenery, I saw a large, car-sized bright orange orb hovering right above one of the houses in my neighborhood. I watched for a second and noticed it was slowly floating to the right. I quickly pulled out my phone to take a video. When I started the video, the light got brighter and then seemed to shrink into nothingness. It was absolutely silent. I checked the video after, and there was nothing there. I think about it frequently. Definitely the weirdest thing I've ever seen. One time, I think it was 2006-ish, my dad called me to come outside. He was standing on a deck with a pair of binoculars. He pointed at something and gave me the binoculars, and I look at what he pointed at. It's hard to explain. It looked like a spinning gyroscope. It was a sphere with rings spinning around each other like a gyroscope, with neon orange and green colors. It was stationary in the sky, not moving. Not a chance it was a drone. I've never seen anything like it again. It was far away, easy to miss if you were not standing outside staring at the sky. When I was a kid, my younger brother and my parents were staying at our pool house for a few days, and when everyone else was asleep, I was still awake as usual due to me having had insomnia my entire life, and I heard a loud, piercing howl come from outside. I focused on trying to figure out what it was, and a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time much closer. I thought it was about 10 feet from our house, and then I noticed deep gnashes in the wall next to my bed and heard it again, coming from the living room. I ducked under the covers quickly, and silently, with just a tiny hole almost unnoticeable to peek through, I saw a large silhouette, and it entered my parents' room. I also smelled moldy cheese and roadkill coming from it, but when I woke up, everything was back to normal. It couldn't have been a bad dream because I don't sleep, and never had an active enough imagination for my conscious or unconscious mind to come up with that. And it was way too vivid the few times I do dream. It's always from a third-person point of view and semi-animated, with no feelings but sight and hearing. When up in the woods in college a few years ago to go stargazing, we parked in a parking lot for a hiking trail and sat in the bed of a pickup and just stared at the stars. Little to no light pollution, so it was absolutely beautiful, and you could see the whole Milky Way. Way above us, about the relative size of the stars, we saw a spinning light, same color as the stars, just spinning around an axis doing probably 80 plus RPMs. Weirdest shit we have ever seen, and we decided to leave shortly after. I was with some friends on the beach in Oregon, just hanging out at night, when one of my friends saw some lights in the sky. All four of us look at the lights and we're trying to figure out what was causing them. I said, it can't be a boat because they are too high of an angle to be a boat. The boat would be on the shore at that point. My other friend mentioned that there was no sound and therefore was probably not a helicopter or aircraft. There were 4 lights total. They moved from right to left relative to our view. The one on the left would disappear and another would appear on the right, almost like they were attached to something spinning and we were only seeing one side of it. We watched and talked about what it could be for about a minute. Then, for no reason, they vanished. No noise, just poof, they were gone. To this day, I still can't come up with a good reason for what I saw and haven't jumped to any conclusions. It will probably be a mystery for the rest of my life. This was roughly 15 years ago.